Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And we want to welcome you all to yet another Fun Fact Friday episode. Now, today we are going to be discussing a food, an animal that went from trash to treasure, from rags to riches, and was once considered to be plentiful for the poor, but is now precious to the posh. If you're impressed by my attempt at alliteration, then you'll be more impressed by the video to follow. So come along with me as we discuss the history of the class-changing crustacean, the lobster. Now, we have to go back many, many years, in fact, basically to the dawn of civilization, to kind of get an understanding about lobster. And when I say that in the introduction, it was a class-changing crustacean, well, it truly was. Because there were certain time periods when it was viewed as a low-born peasant food that the rich would not dare to stain their fingers with. But there are also other factors that we see even today as to why some people might not touch lobster or particular other shellfish. I know I myself love shellfish, for the most part, and I'm talking about the ones that are common, such as lobster, crab, shrimp, crawfish, and I could eat about 5 pounds of crawfish in one sitting. My wife, on the other hand, she's not as big a fan of crawfish as I am, so every time we do a crawfish boil, well, I've got to buy some crab to throw in the pot along with everything else. But so right there is just one small example as to a reason why certain shellfish would be looked upon with potential disdain or something like that. But if you look at the grand scheme of things in human history, and of course the records we have on hand show that practically since the dawn of civilization, lobster has been loved and despised and has been looked upon favorably or in utter contempt. So what are some of these reasons as to why people would avoid eating the lobster? Well, first and foremost, some people, they view shellfish as dirty bottom feeders, kind of like eating possum. They just judge the animal based upon its appearance. They judge the animal based upon its diet, and they think, oh, well, that's not good eating. Folks, I'm here to tell you, I eat everything I catch, hunt, fish, and I've had no problem eating all sorts of varieties of food, ranging from possum to coon, rattlesnake, you name it. So I personally don't have a predilection against it. But, some people, they simply can't get around that fact mentally, and that's okay. It's all up to personal preference. We also see that in some cases, in some cultures, depending on the time and the place, that religion could actually play a factor into why people would not actually consume certain animals or just the lobster as a whole, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, of course. And if I recall correctly, if not, I do apologize, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but if I recall correctly, even today in Jewish religion and customs, it's either you're not allowed to consume shellfish like crab and shrimp and lobster, and even if they have changed some things over time and they are allowed to do so now, they're not allowed to mix it with certain foods. It's basically kind of like trying to be kosher, but with seafood, if you catch my drift. So, of course, there's a lot of different factors into this, and what I found so interesting in my research, that is the stigma behind the lobster at one point being viewed as this peasant's food, this dish of the poor, was so strongly ingrained in the American mind that even into the 1940s, there were children who were growing up, and this is post-Great Depression, this is World War II is going on. They recalled how their family didn't have much, and so lobster, if they were living on the coast, lobster was so plentiful and so available that if they brought a lobster roll to lunch, then that was grounds for actually being made fun of because people knew you were poor. And this stigma behind lobster being a dish of the poor actually goes back for quite a far period in American history in and of itself. As for the rest of the world, we can't really tell much, but we do know that it was stigmatized in early American history. If we happen to go back further and further, though, we actually see that it was greeted with mixed emotions, but more than likely it was actually viewed with popularity. We see that in ancient Rome, lobster was being transported in from the coast, and from the best research that I could find, it was surmised that they were actually toting barrels of ocean water with lobsters inside, so the lobsters could stay relatively well alive, and therefore they could be transported further inland. And it became a mid-range delicacy for people in ancient Rome. We actually see there is a mosaic or a mural in the ruins of ancient Pompeii that shows and suggests that the spiny lobster was valued highly as a food. But if we flash forward past the early imperial period of ancient Rome, when lobster was really being looked favorably upon, we take a look at a later period in history, and we see that from the years 50 AD to 800 AD, the Maca people of Peru actually saw an increase of the lobster's popularity. And lobster was not only being consumed on a regular basis, but its shells were being used to make a light pink dye for their textiles, and they could also use the lobster shells to make ornaments as well as tools. But then again, in the Americas, lobster, for the coastal dwellers, they did use the meat. They did eat the meat, but certain tribes didn't really, mesh with it or anything like that. So what they tended to do was they would actually take the lobster and use it for fertilizer and fish bait. And I'm sure some of you know about the idea of using a fish or some kind of ocean-dwelling critter as fertilizer. As a matter of fact, this is something that a lot of you will probably recall if you go back and jog your memory far enough from the story of the first Thanksgiving, and that was when Tisquantum, or Squanto, was teaching them, the pilgrims that is, how to plant crops, the three sisters, being corn, beans, and squash, that he told them to first plant a dead fish in the soil. So that basically could be accomplished in the same manner by using a lobster. So it just makes sense. But if we go past the Romans and the Maca people of Peru, the Native Americans, pre-Columbian era, pre-contact, we also travel back to Europe after the 800s, and we see it in the Viking period, which lasted from the mid to late 900s AD all the way to the late 1100s AD, that there was a big increase in consumption of lobster amongst Northern Europeans, as well as other marine life. Because at this point, the Vikings, they were building better boats. They were also going all out with improving their ship technology and training sailors, whether it be for fishing or crossing the oceans to raid or sack some kind of town. And because of this, and the fact that people could go further out into the waters to where the richer fishing grounds were, they were able to bring back more marine life for consumption. Thus, the lobster saw an increase in being consumed during the Viking period. But when we get to post-contact between natives and Europeans here in America, we see that although originally the European settlers followed in the footsteps of the Native Americans using lobsters and using fish as fertilizer or bait, they gradually got around to the point that they thought, well, this lobster looks pretty much similar to the ones that we were eating back home. I'm sure these are probably edible as well. And so they did start to consume them, and they did so in great quantities along coastal communities. But as more and more people started coming to the New World, especially more and more upperclassmen, people who came from long lines, lots of money, they saw that the lobster was being consumed so frequently by the mid to lower class. And therefore they turned up their noses at this dish of the poor and passed it off as a peasant's food, not worth the time it would take to boil it. But gradually over time, we see that the taste of lobster started to grow on some of the upper class, especially in the New England area. And from there, they started recommending it to all their other friends, and it finally made its way down south to European colonists and settlers there. And the interesting thing is, though, is that it wasn't really until the late 17th century that we see an increase in the business of the fisheries off the coast of America, and this was brought about by the lobster smack, which is a seafaring vessel which ended up in the ship itself having wells, open wells that would hold seawater, kind of similar to what the ancient Romans did with their barrels, but the boats themselves would have open wells which would hold seawater to keep the lobster alive during transport. And this was very vital because, folks, unlike fish, lobster has to be cooked within 2 days of it being brought out of salt water. In other words, it being killed. And whereas fish, it could easily be salted and preserved in that manner. If you don't do that with lobster within 2 days' time, then you stand a very good chance of poisoning yourself because it releases a lot of ammonia. And if anybody knows anything about that, you know that's a bad time. So the lobster smack was a great invention which helped with seeing the fisheries to thrive and saw that lobster could be, for the time, transported further inland. But it wasn't really until the late 1800s that they had the refrigerated box cars and things like that. And when I say refrigerated, it wasn't electricity. It was a bunch of ice with straw on top of the ice to really kind of prevent it from melting as quickly as it otherwise would. Plus, it soaked up any melted water. So that was a win-win situation. And with these refrigerated railroad cars, they were able to transport lobster further inland, keeping them alive, keeping them fairly fresh, and we see that in certain saloons in the time period of what we know as the Wild Wild West, with Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, all that, there were some saloons that were not only fairly fancy compared to the saloons where you go in up to a rickety old wooden bar, get you a shot of rock gut whiskey. No, these places were immaculate and would provide you not only with all sorts of wonderful entertainment and some of the finest liquors and beers that you could get a hold of, as well as wines, including champagne. They would also be able to provide a variety of dishes that we would now deem a luxury today. Suffice it to say, lobster was also on the menu, but in some cases there were even fresh oysters available on the menu itself. So it was quite phenomenal to see just how within a few decades' time it went from being a food relegated to the poor along the coastal communities and was now considered to be a highly prized item. And it hadn't quite reached luxury status yet. That wouldn't come around until post-World War II, because there were still issues with transportation, keeping food fresh. Freezers still weren't really a thing. Refrigerators were practically still new to the scene. But as we go along and we see new inventions and advancements made to transport food from the coast further and further inland, that lobster became, more widely available, but yet it wasn't fresh lobster. And so therefore we see that the only people who were able to get and afford fresh lobster were the upper class who had the extra money to fritter away in order to obtain that fresh lobster. And this is where we actually see around the 1940s to 1950s that lobster itself started to become a prized delicacy and a luxury menu item for the upper class, which explains how over time it went from being a low-priced canned staple food, going even further back, it was considered a food for the poor. In fact, in a lot of jails that were in coastal communities in the 18th and early 19th century, and even before then, there were prisoners who complained about being fed lobster so many times because it was a cheap alternative source of protein. And some indentured servants wrote down in their agreements that they refused to eat lobster more than twice a week. That's how plentiful it was at the time. But going back to the 1940s and the 1950s, we see that lobster has finally become the delicacy that we know it as today, which explains, even in your average supermarket, why lobster or lobster tail alone is very, very expensive and is really only a sometime food and not the all-the-time food that it used to be. So folks, hopefully that kind of gives you an idea about the history of the lobster, not just here in America, but worldwide, and also gives you an understanding as to why it's deemed the class-changing crustacean, why it went from being the poor man's food to the luxury item of the rich. But with that being said, this concludes today's episode, and we thoroughly want to thank you for following along. As always, we want to thank you, those of you who are following along on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. And as always, if you like the show, help the channel grow. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and if you do, then please feel free to click the bell icon so you'll never miss an upload. But I've already taken enough time out of your day, and I feel it's high time that I go ahead and get out of your hair. So until next week, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum, saying goodbye and God bless.